Welcome to Bossenden Wood, near the village of Dunkirk, not that one, in Kent. A beautiful spot in Kent for lovely walks like this one, but also the site of what was potentially the last battle on English soil. Now, there might be some debate about that, but what we do know happened here was a big fight between someone claiming to be literally the Messiah and an attachment from the British Army. And in this video, I'm going to try and find the exact spot that battle took place. This is the Battle of Bossenden Wood.
This incredibly strange story begins with a charismatic but controversial figure, a man calling himself Sir William Percy Honeywood Courtney, Knight of Malta. Though, in reality, his actual name was John Nichols Thom, a Cornish wine merchant and maltster. And it is with Mr. John Thom that we start this story. He was born to innkeepers in 1799 at a place called St. Columb Major in Cornwall. Thom stayed at school until he was about 18, and then joined a local solicitor's. But as you can probably imagine with where this story is going, he pretty quickly decided the law was not for him. So he tried his hand at innkeeping at a place called Wadebridge, and became a clerk of some wine merchants in Truro, essentially going on to take over the business. By 1821, he was married to a woman called Catherine Fisher Fulpit, and during this period, he became known locally as a tall, strongly built, handsome man who was very good at cricket. Then things took a turn for the worse. By the time he was in his late 20s, his mother, Charity, was placed in Cornwall Lunatic Asylum, where she later died. Then, in 1828, his malting and wine merchant premises in Pydar Street burnt to the ground. He did manage to claim the insurance on the property and was able to rebuild the premises, but 3 years later, in 1831, it is said that Thom received treatment from a surgeon for an attack of insanity, from which he apparently recovered well enough to go back to work, although this was perhaps a little hint at what was to come. Because not long after being cleared to go back to work, he went to Liverpool with a cargo of malt, and then he wrote his poor wife a letter from Liverpool, basically saying that he was just going to go to France. And then it wasn't until over a year later that Thom's family finally heard news that somebody fitting his description and going by the name Sir William Courtney was being held in Maidstone prison.
Right, now this shouldn't actually be too difficult because I did actually find a map that pinpointed where the battle is supposed to have taken place. And obviously it wasn't a big battle, so it didn't really cover, that large of an area. Shouldn't be a problem. Well, hey, for once, I'm outside filming a video in January in Kent, and the weather's actually pretty nice. Just fast forward a couple of hours from now to when I'm stuck in the middle of this wood in a blizzard. Well, this map that I've got actually makes it seem pretty straightforward to get to. Looking at it, I think it should literally just be a case of walking pretty much in a straight line and then turning right. However, knowing my luck, as soon as I need to turn right, some ludicrous obstacle will be right where I need to go. So, wish me luck.
After being released from prison, John Thom arrived in Canterbury. This tall, strapping, handsome man was dressed in exotic costumes with long, dark hair and a full beard, with some local accounts describing his outfit as a very theatrical-looking tunic, upon the breast of which was embroidered in golden wire the Maltese cross, while on his shoulders were thrown the ample folds of a cloak of Tyrian hue. He also liked to call his sword Excalibur. In Canterbury, he found accommodation at the Rose Inn, where he booked in under the name of Count Rothschild, though seemingly he very quickly decided that that wasn't really exciting enough, so he changed that to Sir William Percy Honeywood Courtney, Knight of Malta, heir to the Earl of Devon and the Kentish estates of Sir Edward Hales. Now, it seemed many local people very quickly realised that that was a lot of nonsense, and this guy was perhaps suffering from some slightly exaggerated fantasies. But everybody seemed to like him because he was often found in the middle of town making comical and quite insulting speeches about the local mayor and magistrates, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And from here, John Thom actually started to try and pave something of a career in politics, standing as an independent candidate for Canterbury, where he actually didn't do too badly. He didn't win, but he didn't do too badly. And around this same time, he actually published a lot of papers talking about local social issues, which apparently in some cases actually expressed certain quite progressive common sense views, although surrounded by a lot of absolute nonsense. By March 1833, Thom found himself involved with some smugglers, not as a smuggler himself, but actually standing as a witness for the defence. However, he did kind of put himself in it because the smugglers were found guilty, and Thom was prosecuted for perjury, where he was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 3 months imprisonment and 7 years transportation to Australia. Now, by this point, Thom's remaining family was still aware that somebody matching the description of John Thom was doing a bunch of strange stuff in Kent. And so hearing about the trial and the fact that he was imprisoned, his poor wife, Catherine Thom, travelled to Maidstone to see if Courtney was indeed her long-lost love. When he was brought out to her, she was pretty much like, "Yep, that's my husband," despite Sir William Courtney claiming that he knew nothing of this woman or her family. So they believed Catherine, and after being told about his previous episode of insanity, he was examined by 2 surgeons who eventually declared him of unsound mind, at which point he began his stay in Barming Heath Asylum on the 28th of October 1833. Thom spent the following 4 years in that asylum, but was apparently the model patient, and so it was eventually recommended that he should be released. And he was ultimately granted a free pardon by Queen Victoria on the condition that he returned to the care of his family in Cornwall. But obviously Thom was like, "I don't know those guys, I'm not going to go and live with them." And so he didn't go back to Cornwall, but went to live with a local farmer, a Mr. Francis of Fairbrook. Now, apparently something in the wording of John Thom's pardon meant that they couldn't really do anything about this, and so off he went to live in Boughton under Blean.
Seeing lots of bike tracks down here, so there's not an unreasonable chance that I get mowed down by some kid on a dirt bike here. You'll get to see it, I suppose. That's pretty exciting. Oh, I just stopped to check where I am on the map. And I think I'm there. And I think I can see a footpath. I can also hear voices though, and that is freaking me out just a tiny bit. It's close enough to a path. Whoa! Grace. Well, there's definitely a path here. What will irritate me, because I didn't see anything confirming this one way or the other, it will irritate me if this entire video has been like, let's see if we can find the exact location that we're pretty sure this battle happened. It will irritate me if I get into the middle of these woods and there's just a big old information sign there. Good, obviously, you know, share the history, that's a good thing ultimately, but, you know, kind of makes the video a little redundant because somebody else found it before me. First hurdle. What was I saying about some kind of ludicrous obstacle stopping me from going where I need to go? This would be the first of those. So, onwards and inwards? I don't know, we're going into the woods.
Now would be a good time to learn a little bit about the state of rural England, and in this case rural Kent. Now this period of time was a little bit grim, shall we say, for Kent's agricultural workers and labourers. The radical Swing Riots of 1830 had really demonstrated how desperation had creeped into the rural poor societies. Farm machinery was destroyed, ricks were burned, and threatening letters were sent to people in authority, written supposedly by the mythical Captain Swing. Essentially, low pay and grinding, horrible poverty had finally reached breaking point among the labouring community, and they were trying to have their voices heard the only way they knew how. And we actually briefly touch on the Swing Riots and the Poor Law in my Pennenden Heath video, where we talk about some of the people who were actually executed around this kind of time. definitely go and have a look at that one. And in 1834, what became known as the New Poor Law, which essentially meant we're going to really limit help to the people who are considered the most destitute by creating workhouses, some of Dickens' favourite places to base his novels, and making those the only places where you could go and seek some relief from your poverty. With the slight twist that the whole idea was that they would be so horrible that only the worst, most genuinely destitute people would actually seek them out, leaving people with a wonderful decision to make. Go and live a grinding, horrible life in the workhouse, or continue living their horrible, grinding life where they lived. So life wasn't necessarily the best at this moment in time. And into this tense landscape steps Sir William Courtney, and his radical preaching and his, sometimes common sense ideas that he published in his newspaper, The Lion, on top of his incredibly charismatic appearance and demeanour, actually started to garner him a following. So he was very good at vouching for the poor. But where did this seeming messiah complex come from? Well, the influence that he's said to have had over the poor people in these areas was incredible. And it's said that those who were encouraged to join him did so because he was Christ, and unless they followed him, fire would come from heaven and burn them. And John Tom, or Sir William Courtney, perhaps seeing something in this image of him as Christ, began to declare that he had come to earth upon a cloud and would go away from it on a cloud. And apparently, and not infrequently amongst these poor people, they'd actually begun to worship him as a god. It's also been suggested that the local women found him very attractive because of his big black beard.
What's actually the most likely outcome here is that I take this long-winded, off-path journey through the woods to find this place, and I realised that there was a public footpath going straight to it from somewhere that was much, much easier to get to. It's usually what happens. For now, I'm just going to continue to kind of meander my way through here. And at the same time, look out for musket balls. There is a path. Alright, well, what was I saying? Yeah, here we go. Found another path.
So Courtney had his small band of followers, generally farm labourers and a few smallholders, tradespeople from the local area, and they started to protest. Now, these protests remained pretty peaceful for the most part. That was until the 29th of May, or Oak Apple Day, a public holiday that's not really recognised by anybody now, but was held back at the time before it was abolished in 1859. They'd been generally marching around the local countryside, trying to drum up support amongst other workers. But on the 29th of May, they were marching through the downs waving a flag and carrying a loaf of bread on a pole, which was a traditional symbol of protest. Unfortunately, this peaceful protest had, let's say, begun to spread alarm amongst local landowners. And you can't have poor people alarming local landowners now, we know that very, very well. So, on May the 31st, a local magistrate issued a warrant for Courtney's arrest. A local parish constable, a man named John Mears, along with his brother Nicholas, journeyed to Bossenden Farm where they tried to arrest Courtney. And I've not been able to find clearly what went down at Bossenden Farm, but one way or another, Courtney ended up shooting and killing Nicholas Mears. John Mears and his assistant rushed back to magistrates, who sent word to Canterbury for help, and it was at this point that soldiers from the 45th Foot Regiment were sent to round up Courtney and his men. All in all, they were a detachment of about 100 soldiers, led by a Major Armstrong and 3 junior officers. Along with them came a Mr. Knatchbull, a local magistrate in Faversham who decided to finally deal with this matter himself. By this point, Courtney and his remaining followers, some of whom had actually, for want of a better word, sodded off after the whole murder thing. So at this point there were only about 30 or 40 men. They'd gone to camp at another farm near Bossenden Wood called Fairbrook Farm. Mr. Knatchbull and his posse of around 14 men went to confront them, and after a brief standoff, Courtney and his band disappeared into Bossenden Wood. And it was at this point that the magistrate and his men and the 45th Foot Regiment, try saying that 3 times quickly, made their way into the wood, determined to capture William Courtney, dead or alive.
It is quite funny to think of this group of labourers, farmhands, who all came together behind Courtney, just kind of choosing the woods as the place that they were going to hide out. I know it was 1838, so it was obviously quite a while ago, so the woods were probably still quite an appealing place to go and hide if you needed to. But it does make you think, do they feel a little bit like Robin Hood's band of merry men? Apart from the whole, actual battle and actual death that took place as part of this whole thing, it does feel a little bit like a group of kids just kind of play acting rebellion, Which I suppose, unfortunately for them, did kind of turn out to be the case. And unfortunately for those kids, they were coming up against the British Army, who again, unfortunately for them, had plenty of guns. Something Courtney's band of rebels were sorely lacking.
Apparently the soldiers moved in something of a pincer movement. One Major Armstrong led a troop into the wood from Old Barn Lane, while a Captain Reed's detachment entered the wood from the east closer to Bossenden Farm.
Well, according to the map I have, this is it. And there is a path, I'm stood on it right now, that leads right through here. But I don't see any information signs, no plaques anywhere, nothing particularly obvious. So there's nothing here confirming that this is it.
I've since discovered that there is indeed a stone somewhere in the woods letting people know that the battle happened here. It is, however, a small stone lying flat in the woods, so not necessarily the easiest to spot.
But this is where the Battle of Bossenden Wood took place. I hope it was worth it. Just essentially watched a grown man walk through some woods to find some more woods, so don't know how far the entertainment value of that really goes, but you tell me in the comments. You entertained? I certainly was. I've had a good time. Now, there are multiple accounts of how the battle actually went down. All accounts agree that it was very, very quick, obviously. This was about 100 British soldiers against a band of about 30 or 40 men, most of whom only had sticks, and only Courtney and one other man had pistols. But apparently at the moment that the two groups met in this clearing, let's say, Courtney's men emerging from one side and the soldiers emerging from the other side. Apparently Courtney, being his spiritual self, orders his men to kneel and pray to God, for they would be immune to any bullets that came their way. We're about to find out how that went. Apparently Courtney and his men were ordered to surrender as the soldiers trained their rifles on them. What then followed was essentially a small massacre right here. Apparently Lieutenant Bennett became a little impetuous and wanted to get the arrest of Courtney over and done with. And as he advanced, William Wills, the only other man from Courtney's company to have a pistol, shot Bennett in the chest. Bennett fell to the ground, and as he did, the sudden burst of action encouraged Courtney's men to drive forward with their sticks, at which point the order was given for the soldiers to fire, which they did so. William Courtney was the first from his company to go down, taking multiple shots and dying instantly. Several of Courtney's men around him were also fatally wounded. And in the melee that followed, which remember was only a few minutes, it was a wild and vicious scene of people trying to bludgeon each other to death. Obviously, the two sides were so close to each other that the soldiers didn't really have enough time to reload for another round. But again, the soldiers had the advantage with bayonets on their rifles compared to clubs and bludgeons on the other side. And so after the very brief struggle was over, Courtney's remaining men decided to flee, dodging between the trees to try and run as fast and as far away as they possibly could. And there, essentially, ended the Battle of Bossenden Wood. The rebels' Messiah lay dead, along with around 8 of his company.
And the only soldier to die was Lieutenant Bennett. A young special constable, a man named George Catt, was also shot in a case of friendly fire by one of the soldiers in the confusion. Apparently, Major Armstrong was said to recount after the battle that he never saw men more furious or mad-like in their attack upon us in my life. At which point, it should probably be remembered again that this was a group of about 35 men with sticks rushing at a group of about 100 soldiers with rifles. The bodies of the dead were taken and laid out in the local Red Lion Inn, where, intriguingly, Courtney's corpse was described very eloquently. Apparently he appeared to have been a most noble and muscular man. Notwithstanding his bloody and broken forehead, the fineness of his countenance was still perceptible, although those who had seen him whilst living could scarcely recognize him, as, we know not by whose orders, his large whiskers and beard, as well as the hair of his head, were shaven off, and from the meagre diminutive forms which were stretched at either side of him, he appeared as a giant amongst men of moderate size. Hey, nothing wrong with being described as a man of moderate size. In the days that followed the battle, around 30 of Courtney's followers were arrested, with a handful later tried in the summer at the Maidstone Assizes, and an inquest into the battle returned a verdict of justifiable homicide for the deaths of Courtney and his supporters. Some of the prisoners were described in an account from the Newgate calendar. The prisoners Mears, Alexander Fode and Couchworth were wounded. Fode was a respectable farmer, cultivating a farm of about 60 acres, and it was a matter of some surprise that he should have been implicated in so extraordinary a proceeding. The prisoner Sarah Culver was a woman of about 40 years of age, of respectable connections, and possessing considerable property. She had been a devoted follower of Courtney, but it was presumed that she, like him, was insane. The other prisoners were all persons of inferior station. Those prisoners were given a relatively, for the time, lenient sentence, transportation and imprisonment with hard labour. And it seems the reason for the lenient sentence was that they had fallen under the spell of Sir William Courtney. Even in death, the man's charisma was given an almost spiritual status. As for Lieutenant Bennett, he was buried with full military honours in Canterbury Cathedral.
It's interesting to think of Britain during this period that ultimately wasn't really that long ago, where incidents like this, small skirmishes, riots, things like that, were far, far more likely to have a deadly outcome, and obviously more than likely a deadly outcome for the rebellion. And as much as the men that followed Courtney had ultimately been duped by a lunatic, for want of a better word, shouldn't say lunatic, duped by somebody with some serious mental health problems, they joined him for a reason. The oppression they'd been feeling, the poverty that they were experiencing in their lives was real to them. They were hungry. Their families were wanting for food and comfort in their lives, and they were right on the very narrow edge of existence, because this is what happens when people are under so much pressure just to survive day in, day out. They end up falling behind anyone who will promise them a better life, and that's exactly what Courtney did. And these men ultimately died for that, and there is honour in that. Different times and all that, but ultimately it's up to you to decide whether you think overwhelming and unnecessary force was used here to quell this very small rebellion. For me, myself, ever the sympathiser with the underdog, I'm more inclined to side with those men following Courtney, who were ultimately just trying to feed themselves and their families. They really didn't need to die. And really what those people were experiencing back in 1838 is not all that different to what a lot of people are experiencing today in 2025. People today are struggling. Obviously, you can't really compare quality of life in 2025 to 1838, but it's a similar theme. People have always struggled and people have always felt oppressed, and more so during different periods of strife and pressure. So whether you agree with what happened or not, I'm pretty sure we can all empathise with what these people were going through and with what drove them to such desperate measures. And ultimately, if we're really honest here, they died because some rich landowners got scared. Some things really do never change. Well, as you can see, I am now a short drive away from those woods at St Michael's Church here in Herne Hill, which is tiny and quite lovely. As far as tiny English villages go, this is certainly one of them. And here, next to me, is the sign telling you that Sir William Courtney, or as he's listed here, John, Tom, and his rebels were buried in this churchyard, killed in Bossenden Wood, the 31st of May 1838. And here we have Stephen Baker, 23, George Branchett, 40, William Burford, 32, William Foster, 32, Phineas Harvey, great name, 27, William Rye, 40, John Tom, 38, and Edward Rate, 62. So the ages of the men who were killed really kind of crosses the whole range there, from 23 to 62. Now, I don't actually know this for certain, but I assume this is here because they weren't actually given a proper grave marker in the churchyard, because, see, they were considered criminals. But it's nice that we have this memorial here to at least tell us that they are here. Well, on that note, from a windy Herne Hill, it's on a hill, if the name didn't give it away. This was a really unique story, very unusual, but you know, just the kind of thing that you find cropping up, not just in Kent, but all over the country. Obviously there's a fair amount of history here, and so a fair amount of room for slightly weirder things to have happened, but also interesting from a, you know, whose side do you fall down on? Do you fall down on the soldiers' side, or do you fall down on the rebels' side? Do you fall with Sir William Courtney? I'd be very interested to find out what you think in the comments below, and otherwise I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did like it, then, you know, comment, as I say, like, subscribe, all that really helps me out, and I'll see you in the next one.